The night Minnie Maddox found the dying man in her barn, the rain was coming down so hard she could not see 3 feet past her own lantern, and the thunder rolled across the Kansas plains like God himself was rearranging the furniture. She had gone out to check on her mare, Pearl, because the old horse had been restless all evening, kicking at her stall and whinnying in that particular high-pitched way that meant something was wrong. Minnie had lived alone on this parcel of land outside of Dodge City for 2 years, ever since her father passed and left her the homestead and not much else, and she had learned to trust Pearl's instincts the same way she had learned to trust the gray color of the western sky before a storm. Both of them told the truth when nothing else would. She lifted her lantern high and pushed open the barn door, the wood swollen with rain and groaning on its hinges, and Pearl was indeed nervous, dancing sideways in her stall with her ears flat and her eyes white around the edges. But it was not a coyote or a fox that had set the mare off. There was a man crumpled in the far corner of the barn, half buried in the loose hay, one arm stretched out like he had been reaching for something and simply lost the will to continue. His coat was dark, and at first Minnie thought it was just the shadow playing tricks on her. But then the lantern swung in her hand and the light caught the deep, ugly red spreading through the fabric at his side, and she understood immediately what Pearl had been trying to tell her. She was 24 years old, and she was not a woman who panicked. Her mother had been a practical woman, a woman who had crossed the Missouri River in a covered wagon at 17 years old and never once complained about the hardship of it. And Minnie had inherited that practicality the way some women inherit jewelry. She set the lantern on the workbench and crossed the barn quickly, kneeling beside the man and pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck. His pulse was there, thin and fast, like a bird trapped behind glass. He was tall, even collapsed as he was. Dark hair plastered to his forehead from the rain, a square jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble, broad shoulders inside a traveling coat that had seen better days. He wore a lawman star pinned to his vest, she noticed, or what had been a lawman star. The metal was bent and one of the points was broken off, and she could not tell in the low light what territory it had been issued from. His gun was still in its holster, which told her he had not been robbed, and the wound at his side was from a bullet, that much was clear. "Mister," she said, and her voice came out steady even though her heart was hammering. "Mister, can you hear me?" He made a sound, low and rough, something between a groan and a word that she could not quite make out. "I am going to move you," she told him, the way she would tell Pearl before doing something the horse would not enjoy. "It is going to hurt. I apologize in advance." She got him out of the hay and into the house in stages, which was no small feat because he was a considerable amount larger than she was and mostly unconscious for the effort. She managed it through stubbornness and a series of creative applications of leverage, dragging him across the barn floor, across the muddy yard with the rain soaking them both through, and up the 2 porch steps into the front room of the house. By the time she had him on the floor beside the stove, she was breathing hard and her dress was ruined, and she had already decided she did not care. She lit every lamp in the room and knelt beside him and cut away his shirt with her sewing scissors, and what she saw made her exhale through her teeth in a long, slow breath. The bullet had gone through his left side, which was both the good news and the bad news. Good news because it had exited cleanly and had not lodged itself somewhere it would fester. Bad news because the exit wound was larger than the entry wound, and he had been bleeding for what looked like several hours. The wound was still seeping steadily, and his skin, where she pressed her palm to his forehead, was frighteningly cold. Minnie Maddox had never formally studied medicine, but she had grown up on the frontier, and frontier life had a way of teaching you things that school books did not cover. Her mother had been the woman the neighboring homesteaders came to when there was no doctor available, which in that part of Kansas in 1878 was most of the time, and Minnie had stood beside her mother and handed her instruments and thread, and learned by watching, the way all truly useful knowledge is learned. She worked with focused, deliberate calm, heating water on the stove, cleaning the wound with carbolic solution she kept in the medicine cabinet her father had built along the kitchen wall, threading her needle by lamplight with hands that barely trembled. She packed the wound with clean cloth and then she stitched it, both sides, the entry wound small and neat, and requiring only a few passes of the needle, the exit wound demanding more patience and more thread and more careful attention. The man was not fully unconscious. He surfaced several times while she worked, making sounds of pain that she answered in the same low, steady tone she used with Pearl, telling him she was almost finished, telling him he was going to be all right, telling him to hold still. Once he grabbed her wrist, and his grip was surprisingly strong for a man who had lost as much blood as he had, and she said firmly, "Let go, I need that hand." And after a moment he did. She worked for 2 hours in the dark and the firelight and the drum of rain on the roof, and by the time she tied off the last stitch, the storm had begun to ease, and the man's color had moved from alarming gray to something closer to merely pale. She bandaged him properly, wrapping clean linen around his torso and checking the bandage for seepage, and then she sat back on her heels and looked at him in the lamplight. She noticed now that she was not entirely focused on keeping him alive, quite a handsome man. Not in a pretty way, but in a weathered, worked hard, carved out of something solid way that she had always found more interesting than pretty. He had a long scar along his jawline, old and faded, from something that had happened before tonight. His hands, even relaxed in unconsciousness, looked like the hands of a man who had spent his life doing hard things. She pulled the quilt from the back of her rocking chair and spread it over him where he lay on the floor, because she was not yet certain enough of his stability to attempt moving him to the bed, and she settled herself in the rocking chair with her mending in her lap and kept watch through the rest of the night. She did not sleep. She told herself she was watching for signs of fever or bleeding through the bandage, both of which were true. She did not examine too carefully the other truth, which was that she simply did not want to leave him. Dawn came gray and clean washed through the windows, and the world outside smelled like wet earth and sage and new beginnings, the way the Kansas plains always smelled after a heavy rain. The man on her floor had made it through the night. His breathing had steadied sometime around 3 in the morning, and his color had continued to improve slowly through the dark hours. And when the light came through the east window and fell across his face, Minnie allowed herself to feel something that was almost relief. He woke up slowly, the way a man will who has been genuinely close to the edge and has had to climb a long way back. She watched his eyes move under his lids, watched his brow furrow and then smooth, watched his hands flex once against the quilt. Then his eyes opened, dark brown and surprisingly clear, and he looked up at the ceiling of her front room for a long moment as if he needed to have a serious conversation with it before he was ready to deal with anything else. Then he turned his head and found her sitting in the rocking chair with her mending in her lap, watching him, and something in his expression shifted into something she could not quite name. He looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he cannot immediately explain but is certain is important. He looked at her and then he opened his mouth, and his voice came out rough and low and cracked with thirst, and he said, "What is your name?" He said it the way a man says a prayer. Like the answer mattered in some way he could not yet articulate but felt all the way down to whatever it was inside him that had kept pulling him back from the dark all night. Minnie set down her mending. She looked at him steadily and said, "Minnie Maddox. And you are on my floor, which means you owe me an explanation before I owe you anything." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. It looked like a thing that had been away for a while and was not entirely sure of its welcome. "Thomas Abbott," he said, "and you are right. I owe you considerably more than an explanation." She brought him water first, because his voice sounded like gravel and good intentions, and she was a practical woman above all things, and then she helped him sit up against the wall because lying flat was clearly making him restless, and restless men tended to make poor decisions about getting up before they should. He winced when he moved, and she watched the wince with the particular attention of someone checking whether the stitches were holding, and they were. "There is a bullet hole in you," she said, settling back in the chair. "You lost enough blood to concern me considerably. I stitched you up last night." He looked down at his bandaged torso and then back at her, and something moved through his eyes that was more than gratitude, though it included gratitude. "You did this yourself," he said. "It was not quite a question." "There is no doctor within 15 miles, she said, "and you were in no condition to ride for one." "How long was I in the barn?" "I found you around 10 last night." "It is now," she glanced at the window and the angle of the light, "about 6:30 in the morning." He absorbed this quietly. Then he said, "You sat up with me." "I sat up watching your wound," she corrected, because it was important, she felt, to be precise about these things. He looked at her again with that particular expression, steady and careful and attentive, and said, "Miss Maddox, I am in your debt in a way I cannot readily calculate." "You can start by telling me how you ended up shot in my barn," she said. So he told her, and it came out in pieces the way things do when a man is still collecting himself from having been very close to dying. His name was Thomas Abbott, and he had been a deputy marshal out of Wichita for the past 3 years, working under Marshal Roy Calloway, who was a good man and a fair one. He had been tracking a man named Cutter Dial, who was neither good nor fair but was extremely effective at being dangerous. A man who had robbed 4 stage coaches in 6 months and shot 2 of the drivers, and was generally making himself a considerable problem in the southern Kansas territory. He had found Dial 2 nights ago, or rather Dial had found him, which had the advantage of saving time and the significant disadvantage of resulting in a bullet through his left side. He had managed to get on his horse and ride, which was the only reason he was here at all, because the other option was lying on the road outside of Cimarron, and that option had not appealed to him. His horse had eventually made a decision on his behalf when he was no longer capable of making them himself, and the horse had chosen this barn, which Thomas suspected said something good about the horse's instincts. "Your horse," Minnie said, realizing. "Where is your horse?" "Still in your barn, I would assume. Gray Gelding answers to the name Congressman." "Congressman," she repeated. "He is not particularly fast," Thomas said, "but he has excellent judgment." She went out after breakfast to check on Congressman, who was indeed still in the barn and had helped himself to Pearl's hay and water with the comfortable assurance of a horse who felt his reasons were justified. Pearl appeared to have accepted this with the resigned tolerance of a woman whose space has been invaded by someone she grudgingly respects. Minnie fed them both and brushed Congressman down, because the least she could do for the horse who had delivered his master to her door was make sure he was comfortable, and she looked at the corner of the barn where Thomas had been lying, the hay still dark and matted with dried blood, and felt something squeeze tight in her chest that she did not immediately investigate. She went back inside and found Thomas had managed to get himself to his feet and was standing by the window, one hand braced on the wall, looking out at the yard. He had the quilt wrapped around his shoulders because his shirt was ruined past saving, and there was something about the picture he made standing there in the morning light, broad-shouldered and wounded and looking out at her land, that lodged in some part of her. She had not expected to feel anything for quite some time. "You should be lying down," she said. "Probably," he agreed, and sat down on the floor again because the chair by the fire was hers and he clearly knew better than to take it. He lowered himself carefully, with the controlled, deliberate movement of a man managing significant pain, without making it anyone else's problem, and leaned back against the wall. "How long until you can ride?" she asked, which was a practical question and had nothing to do with any other consideration. "A week," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "If the wound does not sour," she nodded. "Then you will stay here until it is safe for you to travel. I will not have a half-healed man riding out of my yard and undoing my stitching." He looked at her with an expression of faint surprise, as if he had expected an argument about it and was slightly disoriented by its absence. "That is very generous," he said. "It is very practical," she corrected. "I put considerable effort into keeping you alive last night, and I would prefer not to have wasted it." He almost smiled again. It was beginning to look more at home on his face. The next several days arranged themselves around the rhythms of the homestead and the requirements of his recovery, and Minnie found that having someone else in the house changed the quality of the silence in ways she had not anticipated. She had been alone for 2 years and had believed herself accustomed to it, had even convinced herself at times that she preferred it, and now she discovered that what she had actually been was resigned. The difference was significant. Thomas was not a man who required entertaining. He slept when he needed to, which was frequently in those first days, and when he was awake, he was quiet in a way that did not feel like emptiness but like stillness, like the stillness of a man who has learned to be comfortable inside his own head. He ate what she brought him without complaint and helped when he could, and did not offer opinions about how she ran her place unless she asked, which she occasionally did, because he had traveled widely and seen a great deal, and his opinions were often more interesting than she had expected. On the third day, he was well enough to sit at the kitchen table for meals, and Minnie set plates across from each other, and they ate together and talked, and she realized she had not had a proper conversation across a dinner table in longer than she could account for. She had neighbors of a sort, the Hendersons 4 miles east and the Crowley family 6 miles north, and she rode to Dodge City once a month for supplies and occasionally attended the community dances that the Hendersons organized. But conversation and company were different things, and she had been running low on the former. Thomas asked about her land, about how she managed it alone, and she told him. The homestead was 160 acres, which was what the Homestead Act allowed, and she had 60 acres under cultivation in wheat, and the rest in grazing for Pearl, and the 3 head of cattle she kept for milk, and the occasional necessity. She had a kitchen garden that she tended with the particular devotion of someone who understands that vegetables in the winter are not optional, and she had enough in her root cellar and enough put up in preserves to see her through to spring, which was what mattered. "You manage all of this by yourself," he said, and again it was that particular tone, not quite a question. "My father built the house," she said. "And I have good neighbors when things get to be more than one person can manage. There was a barn raising last spring when the old one was not going to survive another winter, and the Hendersons and the Crowleys and the Petersons from over toward the river all came. That is how it works out here." "Did you never think of going east?" he asked. "After your father passed?" She considered this honestly. "I thought about it," she said. "I have a cousin in St. Louis who wrote and invited me. But my father worked this land for 15 years, and my mother is buried on the east slope, and I find I cannot leave either of them behind." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup, and then he said, "That kind of loyalty to a place is something I have never had. You are from nowhere in particular." "I am from Indiana originally," he said, "but I left when I was 19 and have not been back. I have been moving west ever since, following the work, following whatever seemed like the next right thing to do." He paused. "I have not been any place long enough to feel the ground under it." She looked at him across the table, and something in her chest did that squeezing thing again. "That sounds lonely," she said, which was more honest than she had intended to be. He met her eyes and held them. "It is," he said simply, which was more honest than she suspected he usually was with anyone. On the 4th day his fever came, which she had been watching for and had half expected, and it was not as bad as it might have been, but bad enough to keep him flat on the bed she had finally moved him to, sweating through the sheets and arguing with her in a half-conscious way about whether he needed to get up and see to his horse, which she told him she had already done, which he did not entirely believe. She sat beside the bed through most of the day and through the night, and changed the cool cloths on his forehead, and made him drink broth when he was coherent enough to manage it, and talked to him sometimes when he was restless. Not about anything consequential, but just talking. The sound of a voice in the dark being its own kind of medicine. He broke the fever on the morning of the 5th day, and she changed his bandage and found the wound was holding clean and closed and showed no signs of the infection that she had feared. And she allowed herself to feel genuinely relieved about this, which meant she had to acknowledge that her concern for him had gone somewhat beyond the professional interest of a person watching their needlework. He looked up at her from the bed while she was rebandaging him, pale and exhausted and more honest-faced than he probably knew, and said, "You have not slept properly in several days." "I have slept adequately," she said. "You have slept in the rocking chair," he said, "which is not the same thing." "It is my house," she said mildly, "and I will sleep where I choose." "I should be the one in the rocking chair," he said. "This is your bed." "It was my bed," she agreed, "and I will have it back when you are well enough not to need the extra warmth and I am not risking you taking a chill in the night." She smoothed the edge of the bandage and sat back and looked at him. "Now stop worrying about my sleeping arrangements and rest." He rested. But before he closed his eyes he said, quietly and without particular preamble, "Minnie." Just her name, nothing after it. She stood up from the edge of the bed and busied herself folding the clean linen she had used for the dressing, because she needed something to do with her hands. "Rest," she said again, and did not look at him, but she felt the warmth of it settle in her chest and stay there. By the end of the first week, he was getting up on his own and moving around the house carefully, and she found him on the porch one morning sitting in the second chair, the one she had brought out for him without quite admitting to herself that was what she was doing, watching the sun come up over the flat Kansas land with an expression of quiet attention. She brought coffee out and handed him a cup and sat in her own chair, and they watched the sunrise together without speaking, and it was one of the most comfortable silences she had experienced in years. "I need to send word to the marshal's office," he said eventually. "They will be looking for me." "The Henderson ranch has a telegraph line," she said. "Jake Henderson drives into town every Tuesday. If you write the message, I will ask him to send it." "That would be a considerable help," he said. "Thank you." "I will ride over today," she said, and he nodded and then said, "Do not tell them about Cutter Dial. I will handle that communication myself." She looked at him. "You are not thinking of going after him before you are healed?" "No," he said, which she noticed was not quite the same as promising he would not think about it. "Thomas," she said, using his name for the first time since that first morning, and it felt different coming out of her mouth than she had expected, felt like something with weight to it. "That man nearly killed you." "Yes," he said evenly. "He did. And you intend to go back for him." "It is my job," he said, and there was no defensiveness in it, just the plain statement of a man who had considered this and accepted it. She looked away from him, out at the land that was turning gold and rose in the early light. She understood duty. She understood the kind of obligation that sits in a person's chest and does not permit argument. She did not like what she understood, but she understood it. "Then at least let me teach you to cook properly," she said, "so that when you are well and gone you are not entirely helpless." He turned to look at her, and this time the smile that had been making tentative appearances all week arrived fully, and it transformed his face in a way that she was not prepared for, opening it up and making him look younger and warmer and considerably more dangerous than any gun he wore. "That seems like a fair trade," he said. She rode to the Henderson place that afternoon and found Jake Henderson in his barn, a barrel-chested man in his 40s with an honest face and rough hands, who listened to her explanation of the situation with the particular non-judgmental attention of a man who had seen enough of frontier life to know that things happened, and people needed help, and the appropriate response was generally to provide it. "A deputy marshal, you say?" Jake said, taking the folded message she had written on Thomas's behalf. "From Wichita," she confirmed. "He was shot passing through. He is recovering well." Jake nodded. "I will get this sent, Minnie." He paused, looking at her with the particular expression of a kind man who is trying to say something diplomatically. "You need anything else out there? Ruth could come and stay, for propriety's sake." Minnie straightened slightly. I appreciate the thought, Jake, but I have been managing my own propriety for 24 years and I expect I can continue. Jake Henderson had enough wisdom to simply nod. She rode home through the afternoon light and found Thomas in the barn, which was where she had told him not to be because the walking was still too far for where he was in his recovery, standing with his hand on Congressman's neck and talking to the horse in a low voice. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him for a moment before he heard her, watched the way his hand moved on the horse's neck, gentle and familiar, and thought that you could tell a great deal about a man by the way he touched an animal. "You were supposed to be on the porch," she said. He looked up and had the grace to look mildly sheepish. "I wanted to check on him. I told you I was checking on him." "I know you did," he said, and added with absolute honesty, "I trust you completely." "I just also needed to see him myself." She understood this. She could not reasonably argue with it. She came into the barn and checked Congressman's water and his hay and his feet, and then she turned to Thomas and said, "Walk back to the house now before you tear something." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was warmth in it, not mockery, and he walked back to the house and she walked beside him, and when his steps were slightly unsteady, she put her hand briefly under his elbow without comment and withdrew it when he had steadied, and neither of them mentioned it. The reply from the marshal's office came 4 days later via Jake Henderson's boy, who rode out with the telegram tucked in his coat, a 15-year-old named Cal who was clearly delighted to be delivering an important message to a deputy marshal. Thomas read it at the kitchen table while Minnie poured coffee, and she watched his face as he read it, and the expression that moved across it was something complicated, something that had relief and concern mixed in the same place. "They have a lead on Dial," he said. He crossed into the territory heading south. "Oklahoma Territory," she said. "They want me to join the pursuit when I am able." He set the telegram on the table and looked at it. "They have also heard about my injury through a rancher outside of Cimarron who found the place where I was shot, so they know roughly where I am. So they know you are here," she said. "They know I am somewhere in this direction," he said. "I expect someone will ride out inside the week." The word had a sound to it when he said it, and she picked up her coffee cup and looked out the kitchen window. The land was flat and gold, and enormous in every direction. The sky above it a blue so deep it seemed to have physical weight. She had grown up under that sky, and she knew its moods the way she knew her own, and it had never looked either threatening or comforting to her, just true, just the plain vast fact of the place she lived. "Then you have a week," she said. "A week," he agreed. There was a silence between them that was different from the comfortable morning silences they had been sharing, a silence with something in it that was trying to make itself known. She stood up and said, "I am going to make biscuits," because biscuits were something she knew how to do, and the conversation was something she did not yet know what to do with. And she went to the counter and measured flour and lard with her hands and the focused attention of a woman who is using one task to make room for another thing to settle. Thomas sat at the table and watched her work, and after a while he said, "Tell me about your mother." She looked at him over her shoulder, surprised by the request. "What do you want to know? What was she like? You mention her sometimes. You move the way someone moves who was taught things by a particular person." She turned back to her biscuits. She was from Tennessee originally. Her family came west in 1852 when she was 12 years old. She married my father at 17, which was considered reasonable then, and had me 2 years later. She paused, working the dough. She was the kind of woman who made people feel steadier just by being in the room. She had an opinion about everything and she was right about most of it, and she knew she was right and she did not pretend otherwise, which some people found difficult and I found magnificent. "She sounds like someone I would have liked to know," Thomas said. "She would have had opinions about you," Minnie said. "Good ones or bad ones," she considered. She would have been suspicious at first because she was practical about men and did not give the benefit of the doubt before it was earned, but she would have noticed the way you talked to your horse and that would have gone a long way. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "And what about you? What did you notice first?" She pressed the biscuit cutter into the dough with deliberate attention. "I noticed your pulse," she said, "because I needed to know if it was worth trying to keep you alive." And after that, she was quiet for long enough that it became its own kind of answer. "I noticed your hands," she said finally, setting the biscuit rounds on the pan. "They are the hands of a man who has worked hard his whole life. That means something to me." She slid the pan into the oven and dusted the flour from her hands and turned around, and he was looking at her with an expression she had no defenses against, open and serious and entirely unguarded. And she thought that this man who had been so close to dying 8 days ago had something in him that was entirely, dangerously alive. "Minnie," he said, and again it was that way, her name like a thing he was grateful for. "Do not," she said, not harshly, just clearly. "I have not said anything." "You were about to say something," she said, "and I need you to let me think first before you do." He nodded, accepting this, and she went back to her biscuits and he went back to whatever it was he thought about when he sat quietly. And the kitchen was warm and smelled of lard and flour, and the cedar from the firewood she had split herself that autumn, and the afternoon light fell through the windows and made everything golden. That evening after supper they sat on the porch again, which had become the habit of their evenings, and the stars over Kansas were staggering. The Milky Way stretched across the dark like something spilled with intention. She had always loved the stars out here, the way the flatness of the land let the sky be everything, unlimited and immense and yours for the looking. Thomas had his coffee and she had hers, and a light wind was moving across the land with a smell of dry grass and distance, and he said without preamble, "I have not wanted to stay anywhere in a very long time." She looked at her coffee cup. "And now," she said, "now I find I am thinking about how this porch looks in winter," he said. "Whether the snow comes off the plains the way I imagine it does, whether you can see the stars through it when there is not any cloud. It comes like a wall," she said. "Sometimes you cannot see the barn. But the stars after, when it clears, are something I cannot adequately describe." "I would like to see that," he said. She turned to look at him, and the starlight was kind to his face, making it look both older and softer at the same time, and she said, "Thomas, I need to know something." "Ask it," he said. "When the marshal's men come for you, when you have healed up enough to go, what is it that you are intending to do?" He was quiet for a moment, but it was a considering quiet, not an evasive one. "I have been asking myself that same question," he said, "for the past several days, more honestly than I have asked myself anything in a long while. And the job needs finishing," he said. "Cutter Dial needs to be brought in. That is the truth, and I am not going to pretend it is not, because I think you would see through the pretending and lose respect for me, which I find I cannot tolerate the idea of." She felt something warm move through her at the trust implicit in it. "But after the job," he said, and his voice was quieter now, careful and very deliberate. "I have been thinking about coming back." "To Kansas," she said. "To this particular part of Kansas," he said, meeting her eyes, "if I would be welcome." The stars burned above them, and the wind moved through the grass, and Minnie Maddox, who had been practical and self-sufficient and entirely fine on her own for 2 years, felt her practical heart make a decision that her practical mind had not yet caught up to. "You would need somewhere to stay," she said, which was not an answer and was completely an answer. "I would," he said seriously. "I would need to discuss the arrangements with the homeowner." "She is a very reasonable woman," Minnie said. "But she has standards." "I would expect nothing less," he said. And the almost smile had become a full one, and he reached across the distance between their chairs and set his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. And she turned her hand over and let her fingers settle against his. And they sat that way in the starlight until the night grew cold enough to drive them inside. 2 days later, 3 men rode in from the east. A deputy named Harlan Cross, who was large and cheerful and clearly relieved to find Thomas alive, and 2 younger men whose names were Patterson and Webb, who were clearly in awe of Thomas in the particular way that young lawmen are in awe of older ones who have survived things they themselves have not yet been tested by. Minnie fed all 3 of them, because that was what you did when people arrived at your door. And she listened to them talk around her kitchen table with the comfortable efficiency of a woman who knows how to manage a room and not be managed by it. Harlan Cross looked at Thomas and then at Minnie and then back at Thomas with an expression of mild, cheerful calculation that he did not bother to hide particularly well. Thomas met his look with perfect equanimity. "Marshal Calloway sends his regards," Harlan said, "and wants you to know there is no urgency. Dial went aground south of the Cimarron River, and they have men watching the crossing points. He says take the time you need to heal up proper before you join the pursuit." Thomas's glance at Minnie was brief, but she felt it like a hand on her shoulder. "Another 2 weeks," she said from the stove, without turning around. "He needs another 2 weeks before he should ride hard." Harlan Cross looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the table. Harlan Cross smiled broadly. 2 weeks, Harlan said agreeably. "That is fine by us. We will tell the marshal you are in good care." They stayed the night, all 3 of them, sleeping in the barn on fresh hay that Minnie laid down without complaint, and in the morning she made a substantial breakfast and sent them on their way with a cloth-wrapped bundle of biscuits for the road. And Harlan Cross shook her hand with both of his large, warm ones and said, with genuine feeling, "Thank you for what you did for him, Miss Maddox. He is a good man and we are glad you were there." "He would have done the same for anyone," she said. "Yes," Harlan said, "he would. That is one of his best qualities and one of his most troublesome ones." She stood in the yard and watched them ride east until they were dust and then gone, and then she went back inside and found Thomas at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee, and she sat down across from him and said, without any preamble at all, "Tell me about why you became a lawman." He looked at her. He looked at his coffee. He told her. He had come west from Indiana at 19, with no plan and no prospects, and a general sense that the East was too small for whatever it was he needed to become. He had worked cattle drives through his early 20s, which was honest work and good work, but it was someone else's cattle and someone else's purpose, and he had found that he could not make himself care enough about it to stay. He had drifted into Wichita in the spring of 1875, 26 years old and looking for something he could not name, and Marshal Roy Calloway had found him breaking up a fight in a saloon with the kind of calm efficiency that Calloway recognized and valued, and had offered him a badge the following morning. It had fit, the way a thing fits when you have been carrying the shape of it your whole life without knowing it. The lawman's instinct, the particular combination of patience and decisiveness, the ability to read a room and a man and a situation and respond in the way that produced the least harm and the most order. He had been good at it from the start and had grown better at it over 3 years, and he cared about it the way a person cares about a thing they believe matters. "But," she said, because there was clearly a but. "But it is not a life you can build anything alongside of," he said. "You are always moving. Always following the next problem into the next place. And the danger of it is not the part you think it is when you are young. It is not the bullets or the violent men. It is the loneliness." She looked at him steadily. He looked back. "You told me about your mother," he said. "Tell me what you want." The question sat in the air between them, simple and enormous. "I want what my parents had," she said, and she did not look away, "which was hard and good and real. I want someone who understands that this land is part of me and I am not leaving it. I want someone who is honest and capable and who does not treat me like I am delicate because I am not delicate." "You are the least delicate person I have met in years," he said, with complete sincerity and something that was unmistakably warmth. "And I want," she continued, because she had started and she was a woman who finished things she started, "someone who will be there, not someone who is always riding toward the next thing." He was quiet for a long moment and she let the quiet be, and then he said, "I am 30 years old, Minnie, and I am tired of riding toward the next thing. I have been trying to figure out how to be done with it and still be a man I can respect. Finish the job," she said, "the job you are on. Bring cut or dial in, and then decide what kind of man you want to be after that." He looked at her with something in his eyes that she had not seen before, something young and uncertain and entirely undefended. "You make it sound simple," he said. "It is not simple," she said. "It is just clear. Those are different things." He reached across the table just as he had on the porch in the starlight and took her hand, and this time there was nothing tentative about it, nothing waiting to see. His hand was warm and large and certain, and she let herself lean into the certainty of it for a moment. "When I come back," he said, and she noticed that it was when and not if, and she noticed that he had noticed that she noticed. "When you come back," she agreed. The 2 weeks passed in a way that was both too fast and completely sufficient, as if time had made an agreement with itself to be exactly what was needed. They fell into the life of the homestead together as naturally as if it had always included two people, Thomas taking on the heavier work as he was able, splitting wood and mending the fence along the east pasture, and checking the root cellar situation with the serious attention of a man who has begun to think in terms of the coming winter on someone else's behalf. He learned to make biscuits, which took 3 attempts and a great deal of patient instruction, and one genuine disaster that Minnie identified and removed from the oven before it became a catastrophe. And by the 3rd try, he produced something respectable enough that she told him so, which clearly meant more to him than it should have. She read to him in the evenings, from her small collection of books that she kept on the shelf her father had built beside the fireplace. Dickens, and a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman, and a natural history of North America that she had found at the dry goods store in Dodge City, and bought impulsively, because it had a drawing of the Kansas plains in it that she thought was accurate. He listened with the attention of a man who has spent too many years without books in his evenings, and he had opinions about Dickens, which she found endearing, and he read the Whitman silently to himself one night with an expression she could not categorize but would not forget. They talked. They talked about everything that mattered and some things that did not, and she discovered the shape of him as a person the way you discover the geography of a country, mountain by mountain and valley by valley, and what she found was fundamentally good. He was not a perfect man. He was stubborn in certain ways, and he had a tendency toward self-reliance that occasionally crossed the line into not asking for help when he should, and he had not yet entirely made peace with the parts of his past that deserved peace. But he was honest and he was kind and he was paying attention to her, not to a version of her that he was more comfortable with, but to the actual Minnie Maddox, all the practical and opinionated and capable and sometimes lonely parts of her, and he found all of it interesting. She was falling in love with him, and she was clear-eyed enough to know it, and she decided that clarity was the appropriate response rather than alarm. On the night before he was to ride out to join the marshal's men, she made the best meal she knew how to make, which was pot roast with carrots and potatoes from the root cellar and fresh bread, because she had started a batch that morning knowing she would want it, and a dried apple pie because she had apples from the Hendersons' orchard that she had been conserving. And Thomas sat across the table from her and ate with the concentrated appreciation of a man who knows he is about to leave a good thing behind and is trying to take the measure of it properly. After supper they did the dishes together, which they had fallen into the habit of, she washing and he drying and handing her the dried things to put away because he did not yet know where everything went, and she handed him a dish, and he set it on the shelf and turned, and she was right there, closer than she had managed in the careful 2 weeks they had been navigating the question of each other. And he looked at her, and she looked at him, and he lifted his hand and touched her face with the back of his fingers. Very gently, the way you touch something you are deeply, completely serious about. "Minnie," he said, and it was still a prayer, still had that quality, the quality of something enormously important being said in the only way available. She turned her face into his hand slightly, just slightly, and said, "Come back in one piece, Thomas Abbott." "I intend to," he said. And then he kissed her, carefully and with complete intention, and she kissed him back with the same quality of care and the same completeness of intention. And it was the kind of kiss that does not need to be anything other than what it is, which is a serious promise made between serious people. He rode out the next morning with Congressman in good health, and his wound healed clean, and his gear in order, and a saddlebag that she had quietly packed the night before with enough food for 4 days' riding that she did not mention, and that he found without comment, and tucked in beside his other provisions with a glance at her that she received from the porch, and held in her chest all day after he was gone. He had been gone for 3 weeks when the first letter arrived, via Jake Henderson's boy, who was becoming a reliable informal mail carrier, and who clearly enjoyed the importance of the role. The letter was written in Thomas's hand, which was precise and careful and told her something about how he approached most things, and it contained a report of his progress that was factual and not overly dramatic, and at the end of it, in a different quality of handwriting, as if he had paused and then continued with something slightly different in mind, he had written, "I think about the porch in the evenings. I think about what the stars look like from there. I am trying to do this part quickly so I can find out." She wrote back that evening, 3 pages, which surprised her. She told him about the first frost, which had come 2 nights after he left and had been beautiful and devastating in the way of first frosts, the kitchen garden catching it before she could cover everything, and losing the last tomatoes and the basil, but the carrots and the kale taking it in stride. She told him about Pearl's shoe that had needed to be replaced and how Jake Henderson had done it, because she had not yet managed to learn the farrier work herself, which was a deficit she intended to correct. She told him about the Book of Whitman, which she had gone back to after he left and found entirely different readings in than she had managed before, which she suspected had something to do with him. At the end she wrote, "The stars here are just the same as always. I have been looking at them more carefully in the evenings. I believe I am trying to see what you see when you look at them." The second letter came 2 weeks after she sent the first. He had caught up with the marshal's posse south of the Cimarron, and they had tracked Dial through 3 days of hard riding into the Oklahoma territory, and they had found him at a trading post outside of Enid, where he had made the mistake of staying too long in one place, which was the mistake that men like him always eventually made. Dial had been taken into custody without further violence, which Thomas seemed to consider the best possible outcome, and was being transported back to Wichita to face justice before a federal judge. At the end of the letter he said, "I have discharged my duty. I have spoken with Marshal Calloway. He is a good man and he wished me well and said there would always be work for me if I wanted it. But he also said that a man who has found what he is riding toward is more useful to the world than a man who is always riding away from something. He is smarter than he looks, Calloway is. I am riding north. I should reach you by the 20th if the weather holds." She read this letter at the kitchen table with her coffee and her heart doing something that she could feel in her fingertips, and then she got up and went out to the barn and told Pearl, because Pearl had kept this secret from the beginning and deserved to know. The weather held. He rode in on the afternoon of the 20th, with the low November sun behind him and the cold coming in off the plains in long sweeps of wind that smelled like coming snow. And she was at the fence line along the east pasture, checking the posts, when she heard Congressman's hooves on the road and looked up and saw him coming. And she put her hammer in her coat pocket and walked to the gate to meet him. He pulled Congressman up and swung down, which he managed now without any of the careful management of his injury that had characterized his earlier mobility, and he came through the gate and stopped in front of her with the cold wind moving his coat, and she looked up at him and said, "You are 2 days early." "The weather held better than expected," he said. "Your stitches held better than expected too," she said. "I want to see the wound." "Hello, Minnie," he said, with the quiet smile that had become entirely at home on his face. "Hello, Thomas," she said, and something in the simplicity of it, the plain rightness of his name in the cold afternoon air, made her eyes sting in a way she absolutely did not intend and did not comment on. He came inside and she made coffee and he sat at her kitchen table as if he had always sat there, and told her about the pursuit and the capture with the same factual and non-dramatic quality of his letter. And she listened and asked questions, and they talked about Calloway's words at the end of it, and she looked at him carefully and said, And I told him I was going to take some time, Thomas said. A substantial amount of time, to explore other options. Options like what? She said. He looked at her across the table in the late afternoon kitchen light with complete and straightforward honesty. A man with skills and a knowledge of the law has options in a territory like this, he said. There is talk of organizing a proper sheriff's office in Dodge City, real civic work, not the traveling kind, roots in the ground. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That sounds like a man who is thinking about a future. It sounds exactly like that, he said. Because it is exactly that. She stood up and went to the window and looked out at the land that was turning dark gold in the fading light, the flat, extraordinary Kansas plains that she loved and had stayed for and intended to grow old on, and she said, I was thinking, if someone were to want to stay, that the north side of the property is better drained than the south, if someone were to want to build something. There was a long pause behind her, the particular kind of pause that is very full. Something like a house, Thomas said. Something like a house, she confirmed. Though there is no immediate urgency, the current arrangements are functional. She heard him stand up from the table, and she heard him cross the kitchen floor, and she felt him stop behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold coming in from outside kitchen air, and he said, Minnie Maddox, I rode back here because I am in love with you. I want to be very clear about that. She turned around. He was right there, occupying the kitchen in a way that the kitchen had always had room for even when she had not known it. I am in love with you too, she said. I have been for some time, and I found it both inconvenient and entirely worthwhile. He laughed. It was a full laugh, unguarded and warm, and she had not heard it before because she had never said anything quite funny enough to produce it, and she thought she would make it her personal mission to produce it as often as possible going forward. He kissed her, and this time there was nothing tentative or preliminary about it. It was a whole and complete thing, the kind of kiss that is both a culmination and a beginning, and she put her hand on his chest over the place where the wound had been and felt his heartbeat, steady and strong, and thought about finding it faint and frightened in her barn 2 months ago, and felt something so enormous in her chest that it temporarily exceeded her capacity for language. I should see about speaking with someone, Thomas said when they had separated enough to speak, his hands in her hair, her hands at his lapels. Formally, about my intentions. My mother is buried on the east slope, she said, and my father is there too. You can speak with them, or you can speak with me because I am the one standing in front of you. He looked at her. He said, Minnie Maddox, will you marry me? It was not quite a question. It had the quality of something that has been decided and is being confirmed, which was exactly right because that was exactly what it was. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. They were married in January of 1879, in the front room of her house with the stove burning and snow coming down outside the windows, in the way she had described to him, like a wall. And Jake Henderson had ridden over through the weather to be the witness, and Ruth Henderson had come too, and cried in the way that entirely happy women sometimes do at weddings. And the circuit preacher named Reverend Willis had driven his cart in from his usual route, and stood in front of the fireplace with his good book, and performed the ceremony with the warm practicality of a man who had married a great many people in parlors and under trees, and once memorably in a barn. Thomas wore his good suit, which he had retrieved from the trunk he kept with the Hendersons during the weeks of back and forth, and it fit him well and made him look considerably more formal than she was accustomed to. Though the eyes were the same and the hands were the same and the particular quality of attention he paid her was the same, entirely constant. She wore her mother's dress, which she had let out slightly in the sleeves and taken in at the waist, and altered with the same careful hands that had stitched his wound in the dark, and it was cream-colored with small blue flowers in the fabric, and it had survived the crossing from Tennessee in 1852 and 15 years on the Kansas frontier, and the careful preservation of a woman who kept things that mattered. Reverend Willis said the words, and they said their words back to him. And when Thomas put his mother's ring on her finger, a plain gold band that he had carried in his vest pocket for 3 days leading up to the ceremony, with the particular nervousness of a man who knows what is in his pocket and cannot stop thinking about it, she felt the solid weight of it settle on her hand and felt completely, entirely right in a way that she had not known she was waiting to feel. Jake Henderson shook Thomas's hand and clapped him on the shoulder with the warmth of a man who is genuinely pleased for everyone involved, and Ruth Henderson hugged Minnie and said into her ear, "Your mother would have approved, and you know it," which made Minnie's eyes sting in the way that only the truest things did. They had a modest meal together, all 4 of them plus Reverend Willis, who was a man who appreciated a good meal after a ceremony. And there was the pot roast because Minnie had made the best thing she knew, and there was bread and there was dried apple pie, and there was even a bottle of good whiskey that Jake Henderson had brought as a gift, and that they shared around the table with the unceremonious warmth of people who know each other well enough for warmth. The Hendersons and Reverend Willis rode home before dark because the snow was still coming and the road home was long. And then Thomas and Minnie were alone in their house for the first time as a married pair, and the stove was warm and the snow was falling, and the stars were behind the clouds, but they were there, and they both knew they were there. Thomas got the sheriff's appointment in Dodge City that spring, which was an organized process involving 3 meetings with the town council and a formal review of his record as a deputy marshal that Thomas found somewhat tedious, but submitted to without complaint. Marshal Calloway wrote a letter of strong recommendation that Thomas read and then put away quickly without commenting on it. But she found it later, folded in his coat pocket, and read it. And it said, in Calloway's direct no-nonsense style, that Thomas Abbott was the finest lawman he had worked with in 20 years of service, and that whatever town was fortunate enough to appoint him would be getting not only an effective officer but an honest and decent man. And those 2 qualities were rarer together than they had any right to be. She put it back in his pocket without telling him she had read it. The sheriff's office in Dodge City was a proper position, rooted and civic in the way that Thomas had described to her in the kitchen that November afternoon, with a regular salary and a courthouse appearance schedule, and the particular kind of ongoing work that was about maintaining a community rather than chasing through the territory after dangerous men. It was not entirely without risk because Dodge City in the spring of 1879 was still a place where cattlemen came off the trail with pay in their pockets and strong opinions about how to spend it, and occasionally those opinions required a firm, steady hand to manage. Thomas was very good at the firm, steady hand, but he came home evenings. That was the thing that she had not quite been able to imagine until it was simply true, the way certain good things are not fully real until they happen. He came home evenings, and they ate together and talked about their days and sat on the porch when the weather allowed and read by the fire when it did not. And she thought about the 2 years she had been alone on this land, alone under those enormous Kansas stars, and she was grateful for those years because they had made her the person she was, capable and clear-eyed and not dependent on anyone else for her own identity. But she was more grateful for this. He built on the north side, through the spring and into the summer, with help from Jake Henderson and the Crowley boys and a carpenter named Delacroix from town who had good hands and a fair price. It was not a separate house, which had been the original way she had described it in the kitchen when they were being careful about things, but an addition to the existing house, because the existing house was where she had grown up and where her father had built the medicine cabinet along the kitchen wall and where the shelf of books stood beside the fireplace. And Thomas had understood without being told that she would not leave those things behind. The addition added 2 rooms to the north side of the house, a sitting room with windows that faced the north and west where you could see the weather coming from a distance, which was the most useful view on the Kansas plains, and a room off it that they did not immediately discuss a purpose for, but that they both understood, in the way that married people understand things, was waiting for when it was needed. She became pregnant in the autumn of their first year together, which they discovered on a Tuesday morning in October when Minnie had been feeling unwell for a week and had finally identified the particular quality of the unwellness and sat down and looked at the calendar and done the mathematics that needed to be done. Thomas was at the sheriff's office when she figured it out. She spent the morning in the kitchen garden harvesting the last of the autumn carrots, thinking about it, turning it over in her mind the way she turned a good thing in her hands to see all of it. She did not feel afraid. She felt, which surprised her slightly, an almost ferocious sort of joy, the kind that comes from something you have wanted without knowing how much you have wanted it until it is suddenly real. Thomas came home for midday dinner as he usually did, because the office was close enough to make it practical, and she set the food on the table and sat down across from him, and he looked at her face and he said, before she had said a word, "What has happened?" "Something good," she said. He waited. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He put down his fork, he looked at her. His face did something extraordinary. It opened completely. All the careful competence and steady reserve that he wore as his professional face fell entirely away. And underneath, it was something unguarded and luminous that she realized she was the only person alive who got to see. He came around the table and he held her face in his hands, and she felt him trembling slightly, just slightly, and he said, "Minnie." And this time it was not a prayer, or it was a prayer but a different kind, a prayer of gratitude rather than a request, the kind you say when something has been given to you that you did not dare ask for directly. She put her hands over his. She said, "You are going to need to fix the loose board on the front porch. I will not have a child learning to walk on a loose board." He laughed, that unguarded full laugh that she loved, and he pressed his forehead against hers, and she felt the laughter of him and the warmth of him and the solidity of him. And outside, the Kansas autumn was brilliant and cold and clear as a bell. Their son was born in June of 1880, which was a fine month to be born in on the Kansas plains, when the land was green and the days were long and the sky above the homestead was that particular deep summer blue that seemed to go on forever. He was healthy and loud about it, which the midwife Mrs. Clausen said was exactly right, and he had dark hair like his father and Minnie's gray eyes, which Thomas found remarkable and looked at for a long time. They named him Henry James Abbott, Henry for no particular reason except that it sat right in both their mouths, and James for Thomas's father, who had been a good man by all accounts, and to whom Thomas had not said goodbye when he left Indiana at 19, and had carried that weight quietly ever since. Naming the boy for him was a small settlement of an old debt, and Thomas Abbott was a man who believed in settling debts. Henry was 3 months old when Thomas brought him out to the porch one evening to show him the stars, which was probably earlier than Henry could process the stars in any meaningful way. But Thomas apparently felt the introduction should be made sooner rather than later. Minnie stood in the doorway watching her husband hold their son and point upward at the enormous Kansas sky with the particular earnestness of a man who has been given a completely unexpected second chance at something and intends to get it right. She thought about the night in the barn. She thought about her hands on his skin in the dark, the needle and the thread, the sound of rain on the roof and Pearl nervous in her stall, and this man's pulse under her fingers, thin and fast and determined. She thought about his eyes opening in the morning and looking at her like she was something important. She crossed the porch and stood beside him and looked up at the stars, and Henry made a small sound of no particular opinion about them. "What are you showing him?" she asked. "The Dipper," Thomas said. "And Orion, though Orion is faint this time of year. And that one there," he pointed, "which I do not actually know the name of, but it is the brightest thing in the sky tonight, and I thought he should know about it." "That is Jupiter," she said. "Jupiter," Thomas repeated, adjusting the information into the lesson. "That one there, Henry, is Jupiter. It is a planet and it is enormous, and your mother knows things like that because your mother knows everything." "I do not know everything," she said. "You knew I was worth keeping alive," he said, looking at her sideways. "That night in the barn you could have left me for the rain." "I could not have," she said. "That is not in my nature." "No," he said, "it is not." He put his free arm around her, and she leaned into him, and Henry on his other side made a small sound that might have been contentment or might have been gasp, but which they chose to interpret as the former. "I think about that sometimes," Thomas said. "What would have happened if Congressman had chosen a different barn, or no barn at all?" "He has excellent judgment," she said. "You said so yourself." "The finest judgment of any horse I have ever known," Thomas agreed. She looked up at the stars, at Jupiter burning steadily in the summer dark, and felt the weight of her life, not as a burden but as a substance, something with depth and reality to it. The land under the porch, and the house behind them that her father had built, and her mother was in the ground of, and that now had 2 new rooms on the north side that smelled of fresh wood and purpose. The man beside her, who had been a stranger dying in her barn, and was now the person she reached for in the night without thinking about it. The son who had Thomas's dark hair and her gray eyes, and who was currently studying the stars with the total incomprehension of an infant and the absolute openness of a new person, for whom everything was still being revealed. The world had felt small and complete in its loneliness, those 2 years before. It had felt like a thing that was exactly the size it was going to be. She had been wrong about that, and she was grateful for the wrongness. Henry grew with the steady determination of a child who has interesting parents and considerable amounts of space to grow in, and the homestead absorbed his presence the way good land absorbs rain, completely and with visible benefit. He walked at 11 months, which was on the early side, and he fell down frequently and emphatically, and got back up with the same emphatic determination every time, which Thomas observed with considerable parental pride, and Minnie observed with the particular recognition of seeing a temperament she knew. "He is stubborn," she told Thomas when Henry was 14 months old and had decided the matter of the porch steps could be conquered that afternoon and was proving his point at length. "He is persistent," Thomas said. "There is a distinction." "There is not as much of a distinction as you think," she said. By the time Henry was 2, Thomas had been sheriff of Dodge City for 2 years and had established a reputation for a particularly effective combination of firmness and fairness that the town respected, and the cattlemen had learned to work with rather than around. He had hired 2 deputies, young men who were serious and capable, and who learned from him the way he had once learned from Callaway, the transmission of knowledge through example that was the best kind of teaching. The town was growing, which was the nature of Western towns in those years, 1880 into 1881, the railroad already established, and the cattle trade still substantial, and new families arriving each season to take up land and set down roots in the vast flat country. Minnie watched it with interest because growth meant change, and change on the frontier was both necessary and complicated, and she was the kind of woman who paid attention to both the necessity and the complication. She had expanded the kitchen garden by 1/3 and had begun selling surplus vegetables to the dry goods store in town, which became a small but reliable additional income, and also meant regular trips to Dodge City that she made with Henry in the wagon while Thomas was at the office. And she came to know the town with the particular knowledge of someone who moves through it regularly with purpose, rather than just occasionally for supplies. She made friends there, proper friends of the kind that take time and honesty to develop. A woman named Clara Birch who ran the millinery and had strong opinions about most things, and a laugh that could be heard from across the street. A schoolteacher named Agnes Morton, who had come from Ohio the previous spring, and who was teaching the growing population of children in the newly built schoolhouse, and who was earnest and funny in equal measure. These friendships mattered to Minnie in a way she had not quite expected them to. She had been largely self-sufficient for so long that the discovery that company enriched her rather than complicated her was both obvious in retrospect and somehow surprising in the present. Clara Birch met Thomas for the first time at the community dance that autumn and looked at him and then at Minnie, and raised her eyebrows in a way that contained an entire editorial. And Minnie said, "Do not." "I have not said a word," Clara said. "You said volumes," Minnie told her. "I was simply thinking," Clara said serenely, "that a man who dances as well as your husband and still manages to look like he would rather be quietly watching is a very interesting combination." "He is," Minnie agreed. Thomas, for his part, had noticed Clara Birch noticing him and had responded with the equanimous calm he brought to most things, though later, walking home under the stars with Henry asleep in his arms, he had said quietly to Minnie, "Your friend Clara is formidable." "She is," Minnie said. "Good," he said. "You should have formidable friends." She took his arm and they walked through the Dodge City street in the cold October night, past the lit windows and the sound of music still coming from the dance, and she thought about the particular shape of this life, how it had been built piece by piece from the ground up the way her father had built the house. One thing, and then another, until it was something you could stand inside and call home. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1882, which made Henry nearly 2, and she came into the world with the same healthy announcement her brother had made, and with dark brown eyes that were Thomas's exactly, looking up at the world from her first moments with the considering, patient attention of a person who was going to think carefully about things before she acted. They named her Rose Eleanor, Rose for the wild roses that grew along the east fence line in June, and that had been blooming when Minnie first realized she was expecting, and Eleanor for Minnie's mother, which Thomas had suggested himself, which made her love him in a sharp, specific way that was different from but not less than the other ways she loved him. Henry was fascinated by Rose in the way of older siblings who are too young to be strategic about it, which meant his fascination was entirely genuine and occasionally overwhelming and required management. He wanted to show her things, the horses, the kitchen garden, the section of the fence where he had discovered that ants were doing something complex and industrious, and the fact that Rose was not yet capable of appreciating these things did not deter him. He showed her anyway, holding things up to her face with the complete confidence of a person who is certain the other person will agree once they understand. Thomas watched Henry doing this one evening from the porch, his daughter in his lap and his son crouched in the yard, demonstrating something about a particular interesting rock to her general direction. And he had an expression that Minnie had learned to read as the expression of a man who cannot quite believe this is his life, and is not taking a single day of it for granted. She brought him coffee and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her without looking away from the children, and she leaned into him and looked at the same thing he was looking at, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Harlan Cross came through Dodge City in the summer of 1882, which was a happy reunion that involved a substantial dinner at the Abbott house, and Harlan's particular brand of large, cheerful presence filling the front room and delighting Henry, who was nearly 3, and thought that anyone who could make that much noise and take up that much space in such a good-natured way was the finest sort of person. Harlan held Rose with the careful, specific attention of a large man who knows he is large and adjusts accordingly, and looked at Thomas with an expression that contained the particular warmth of a man who has been genuinely worried about a friend for a long time and has now arrived at the other side of the worry. "Calloway sends his regards," Harlan said, over dessert, which was the dried apple pie that Minnie had made because it had become the official Abbott House special occasion pie. "He says to tell you the Dial case was properly concluded. Federal court in Wichita, 15 years. Thomas nodded. "Good," he said simply. "And he says to tell you," Harlan continued, with the tone of a man delivering a message he has been looking forward to delivering, that he considers the best decision you ever made was getting shot in the right barn. Thomas looked at Minnie. Minnie looked at Thomas. "Calloway is smarter than he looks," Thomas said. "Much smarter," Harlan agreed. That night, after Harlan had gone to the hotel in town and the children were asleep, and the house was quiet in the way it was quiet when everyone who should be in it was in it, Thomas and Minnie sat on the porch in the summer dark, and the stars were everything they had always been, constant and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small human lives lived under them, which Minnie had always found not diminishing but freeing, the way real freedom sometimes presents itself. "I keep thinking about that night," Thomas said, and she knew which night. "The barn," she said. "The barn," he agreed. "I keep thinking that I was so close to not making it. That I rode toward that barn by luck and horse judgment and not much else. And I think about what I would have missed." He paused. "What I almost missed." "You did not miss it," she said. "You are here." "I am here," he said, with a weight in it that was not solemn but profound. She reached across and took his hand, which was something she did often and which never felt routine, always felt chosen, the way you choose to say something true when you could say something easier. His hand was warm and large and familiar and entirely certain. "Thomas," she said. "Minnie," he said, and still after everything, it sounded like a prayer. The same prayer from the morning. He woke up on her floor and looked at her like she was the most important thing in the room, and asked her name with all of himself in the asking. 3 years of marriage and 2 children, and a house that had grown and a town that knew them, and a life that was full and real and entirely their own. And still, when he said her name, it had that quality. She had decided in the beginning that clarity was the appropriate response to falling in love with him. She had been right about that. She had not known, in the beginning, how much there was to be clear about. How much depth there would be in it, how much richness, how many ways love had of being itself across time. She had known what her parents had and she had wanted it, and she had not fully known what she was wanting because you cannot know the whole of a thing before you are inside it. Now she was inside it. Now she knew. "I fixed the loose board on the porch this afternoon," Thomas said, which was such a Thomas thing to say that she laughed, softly so as not to wake the children. "I know," she said. "I heard you doing it." "Henry helped," he said, "or he tried to help. He held the nails. He is very serious about the nails." "He is going to be a very serious person," she said. "He already is," Thomas said fondly. "Rose is going to be the one who surprises us." She thought about her daughter's dark, considering eyes and thought he was probably right. The years arranged themselves with the unhurried intention of a life being well lived. Henry started school in the fall of 1883, where Agnes Morton taught him with the particular patience of a woman who understood that serious children needed to be taken seriously. And he proved to be excellent with numbers and interested in natural history, which delighted Minnie, who gave him the book with the drawing of the Kansas plains, and watched him read it with a concentration that was familiar to her from a particular angle. Rose walked at 10 months and talked in full sentences before she was 2, and proved Thomas correct in his assessment of her as the family's primary source of the unexpected. She had opinions that she expressed directly and without particular interest in whether they were well received, which Minnie found familiar in a way that made Thomas look at her sometimes with a smile he was not quite hiding. Thomas served as sheriff through 1883 and into 1884, building the office into something genuinely solid, something the town depended on and the county recognized as well run. And he trained his deputies with the same investment he had been trained with, the investment of someone who understands that good work outlasts the individual doing it. The frontier was changing in those years, becoming something slightly less wild and slightly more organized, which was both progress and loss in the way that change always is. And Thomas navigated it with the steady adaptability of someone who has been moving through changing country his whole life and learned not to grieve what the land was becoming while it was becoming it. The Hendersons' oldest son, Cal, the boy who had been their informal mail carrier in the early days, got married in the spring of 1884 to a girl from the Crowley family, which brought the two neighboring families into a new configuration of connection, and meant that Minnie's good neighbors were now her extended family by a sort of frontier logic. And there was a wedding dance at the Henderson place that lasted 2 days and included most of the county, and was the sort of event that people talked about for years. Minnie danced with Thomas twice, which was proper, and once with Jake Henderson, and once with Henry, who was barely 4 and entirely confident about his dancing capabilities, and she watched her husband across the room, talking to the Crowley men with his coffee cup in his hand and that particular quality of attention he paid people, making them feel genuinely listened to. And she thought, this is what she had meant when she said she wanted what her parents had. Not any specific thing. Just this quality of life, lived fully and honestly, and in the company of someone you were genuinely glad to know. In the autumn of 1884, Minnie discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time, which she told Thomas on a Thursday morning at the kitchen table, and which he received with the same complete joy he had shown the other 2 times, less surprised now but no less moved, and he reached across the table and took her hands in both of his with the warmth of a man who has learned to receive good things without immediately worrying about what might complicate them. 3, he said. 3, she confirmed. Henry will have opinions about this, he said. Henry has opinions about everything, she said. He comes by it honestly. From which parent? Thomas said mildly. She gave him a look, and he smiled, and she smiled back at him. And the kitchen was warm, and the morning light was coming through the east window the way it always did, finding the table and the coffee cups, and the two of them sitting across from each other. And it was ordinary, and it was extraordinary, and she had learned that those two things were not as different as she had once imagined. Their second son was born in May of 1885, which made 3 children, Henry 5, Rose 3, and now this new boy who arrived in the same healthy and emphatic way as his siblings, and who had Minnie's dark hair and gray eyes, which made Thomas say, looking at him, "He looks like you," with such simple satisfaction that it produced, involuntarily and entirely against her practical nature, a few tears from Minnie that she attended to quickly and without commentary. They named him Walter Thomas Abbott, Walter because it was Thomas's father's middle name, and they felt the family owed James Abbott at least one more debt, and Thomas because Thomas insisted, quietly and with absolute sincerity, that it was a name he wanted in the family. And Minnie had not argued with him because she did not argue with sincere men, and also because she found she entirely agreed. Henry took his position as oldest sibling with the gravity of a 5-year-old who has been given important responsibilities and intends to honor them. He presented Rose with a careful explanation of their new situation, and proposed that they work together to manage Walter's introduction to the various important features of the homestead, and Rose listened to this proposal and said that she agreed in principle, but reserved the right to make her own decisions about how to implement it, and Henry, being a thoughtful child, accepted this amendment. Thomas stood in the doorway watching this negotiation with an expression of complete delight. "They are running a governance system," he said to Minnie quietly. "They are running our house," she said. "They have been running our house since Henry could walk. Should I be concerned about that?" "I think you should be proud of it," she said. He put his arm around her from behind, standing in the doorway together watching their children in the yard, and pressed his lips to her temple in the particular way he had, quiet and certain and entirely present. The homestead had become, in the years since the night in the barn, something that the surrounding community recognized as a landmark of a certain kind, not a landmark of spectacle, but of stability, the kind of place you pointed to when you were explaining to newcomers how things worked out here, how people built lives in this enormous country with the sky pressing down on all sides and no guarantee of anything, and just the work of it and each other to hold on to. Minnie Maddox Abbott, who had set her heels into this Kansas ground at 22 when her father died, and had not moved them since, who had built a kitchen garden that was the envy of 3 neighboring homesteads, and a medicine cabinet that the surrounding families still came to in situations that required more than basic remedy, who had stitched a dying man's wounds by lamplight in the dark, and asked him nothing about himself, until she was sure he would survive to answer, had become exactly what she had intended to be when she decided not to go to her cousin in St. Louis. She had become the woman this land needed. And this land had, in return, delivered to her barn a man named Thomas Abbott on a rainy October night, delivered by a horse with excellent judgment and the particular good sense to stop somewhere that mattered. On the evening of their 6th wedding anniversary, January of 1885, Thomas brought her outside into the cold, and they stood in the yard and looked up at the stars, which were extraordinary that night, the kind of display that made you understand why ancient people had told stories about them. Henry and Rose and Walter were inside with Ruth Henderson, who had come to sit with them as a gift to the occasion, and it was just the 2 of them in the cold night with the stars blazing overhead and their breath making clouds between them. "Do you remember," Thomas said, "the first morning, when I asked you your name?" "I remember," she said. "I was not entirely conscious," he said, "but I remember the light, and I remember your face in it. And I remember thinking," he paused, "that whatever else happened I needed to know your name. Because," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quality of quiet she knew as thinking rather than hesitating. "Because you were the most important thing in the room," he said. "I could not have told you why at the time, I could not have articulated it, but I knew it, the way you know certain things in a state past reason." He looked at her. "You were working on me in the dark, and I came up through it far enough to see you, and I knew." She looked up at the stars and then at him. "I knew too," she said. "Not that morning, a little later, but I knew." "How much later?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "When you let go of my wrist," she said. "When you grabbed it and then let go because I told you to. That was when I knew something was happening." He laughed softly. "You fell in love with my capacity to follow instructions." "I fell in love with your capacity to trust someone," she said, which was more precise, and which he received with the seriousness it deserved. He pulled her close in the cold night, and she put her arms around him and felt his heartbeat, steady and strong and entirely there. The same heartbeat she had found faint and frightened under her fingers in the barn, and had decided was worth saving. And she thought about all the ways a life can turn on a single night, on a single decision, on the quality of attention you bring to a dark moment. She had stitched his wounds in the dark, and he had woken and asked her name like it was a prayer. And the answer to that prayer had turned out to be a life, a whole abundant life with Kansas stars above it, and children sleeping inside it, and this man's arms around her in the cold, and the land under her feet that was hers and now theirs, and would someday be Henry's and Rose's and Walter's, because that was what land did when you gave it your life in return for its constancy. The stars burned above them without comment, which was their way, vast and permanent and entirely themselves. She pulled back enough to look at his face, her husband's face that she had memorized in the lamplight of that first night, and that had become the face of her home, and she said, "Happy anniversary, Thomas." He looked at her with those dark eyes that had been asking her questions since the morning they opened, and found her in the rocking chair with her mending, asking her questions without words, asking her all the questions a person asks when they are paying real and genuine attention to someone they love. "Happy anniversary, Minnie," he said, and her name in his mouth was still what it had always been, from that very first croaked and desperate and grateful morning, still a prayer, still said like the most important word in his vocabulary, which she had come to understand was exactly what it was. She took his hand. He held it. They stood together under the Kansas stars that she had looked at alone for 2 years and would never look at alone again. And the cold was cold, and the night was enormous, and the stars were beyond counting. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Inside, Henry was probably explaining something important to Rose, and Walter was probably asleep in Ruth Henderson's capable arms, And Congressman was in the barn that had started all of this, and Pearl was beside him, as she always was now, accepting his company with the resigned warmth of a horse who has made peace with an arrangement that turned out to be a great deal better than she had first expected. The world was exactly the size it was supposed to be. It had taken a dark night and a needle and thread and a man who woke up asking her name to show her that. But she knew it now, fully and completely and without question. And she did not intend to forget it for a single day of the long, good, full life that was still stretching out ahead of them, wide as the Kansas sky and twice as full of light.